book on which this film is based, Preventing Genocide, Practical Steps Toward Early Detection and Effective Action, lays the historical, analytical, and future-oriented basis for this documentary. To prepare the documentary, the group conducted a set of 28 filmed interviews with leading figures in preventing mass violence, with whom I have worked closely over many years. They represent a wide range of valuable perspectives on this crucial topic. The novelty of the film, and of the book on which it is based, is the emphasis on growing opportunities for prevention. Who can do what to avert mass violence and arrive at just solutions? The 20th century was a century of genocide and slaughter unimaginable in human history. From the Armenians to the Nazi Holocaust to Rwanda, human beings killed other human beings in the millions, primarily because they were perceived as different and vulnerable. Even today, genocide and mass murder go on in Darfur, with the world seemingly unable to put an end to the bloodshed. After the Nazi Holocaust of World War II, the world said never again, yet it has happened again and again. We have the great privilege of interviewing Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, and in the minds of many, including myself, the greatest Secretary General in the history of the United Nations, and an authentic world leader in the prevention of mass violence.
But I think when I look back, we first went through the World War, and we saw how man can be really evil, and we saw man's inhumanity to man, and we said never again. But then came the troubles in former Yugoslavia. We saw what we lived through in Rwanda, and then eventually in Kosovo. And those were really very turbulent years, and the international community was beginning to grapple with how we deal with these issues. And when you look at it, each one was dealt with differently and in a way not very competently.
And with today's more deadly weaponry, including nuclear weapons, the next genocide could be the last. But genocide can be prevented. The first genocide of the 20th century took place in the Ottoman Empire in the early 1900s against the Armenian people. Dr. Hrant Khachaturian, a professor at Stanford University, describes his own family's experience with the Armenian genocide of the last century.
It is particularly significant for me because in my family's case, the first disaster really was not in 1915, but 1894, when my maternal grandfather was killed. Once you light these fires, it's difficult to put them out. So something more like, again, these figures are impossible to exactly verify, but anywhere from 30, 50,000 to up to 300,000 Armenians were killed. Now, let me finish what happened to my grandfather, because that sort of puts it in a more personal context. One night, they noticed that the the reception room of the Mufti's house is the lights are on for a long time into the night, and they wonder what's happening. Usually these people, in bed by this time. The following morning, the Mufti's young son comes and tells my grandfather, this is a Saturday, before you go to the bazaar today, come and talk to my father. So my grandfather says, okay, but doesn't go. The boy now runs after him, says, please, my father says it's extremely important that you come. He says, I'll come as soon as I get back from the bazaar. Well, what was happening the night before was that they were planning that one day massacre was going to take place in the bazaar. And the Mufti knew it. My grandfather was his friend. He wanted to warn him. So my grandfather goes to to the bazaar, and of course, an hour later, suddenly there is this disturbance, and people rush around. They catch him, and his own butcher takes a cleaver and splits his head. Then they take his keys, they rob his store, and of course, he never gets back home. By noon, everybody knows what's going on. And at the end of that day, this is over. So it's all planned and executed, and this is not like a mob is, going on rampage. So that's essentially the story of the Hamidian massacres. Now, even though, and I want to come back to your earlier point, even though this was not intended as a genocide in the sense of exterminating the people, it set a precedent that you could kill several 100,000 people and get away with it. And in fact, they got away with it. Nothing happened. So in that sense, there is very much a connection with what happened in 1894, 95, 96, and a couple of decades later.
Dr. Khachaturian, a psychiatrist by training, explains the emotional factors and the denial that contribute to a genocide despite the warnings.
Even those who are going to be victimized deny or cannot conceive that something like this can happen. It's very hard. And they go on living, they try to patch things up. Even when the deportation started in 1915, for a while, people were saying, oh, they are going to deport the people of this town, but not us. The Catholics, but not the Protestant. The tall people, not the short people. And because in a way, it's so comforting, because the alternative is inconceivable until it happens.
As horrible as the Armenian genocide was, it was exceeded by the worst genocide in history, the Nazi Holocaust. 6 million Jews were exterminated by Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany. While Hitler had broadcast his intentions to the world in his 1924 book, Mein Kampf, the world ignored his warnings. Brian Urquhart became a leading official of the United Nations for decades after the war. He started his career as a British officer in World War II and helped liberate a Nazi death camp.
We got to this encampment. The first thing I saw of it was a very, very high electric wire fence with what appeared to be logs stacked up against it from the outside. When we got closer, it turned out to be corpses. And this was my first encounter with the Belsen concentration camp. And we finally worked our way around to the front gate. It was a terrible scene. For some unknown reason, the British never told the army about concentration camps. I had seen demolished cities, refugees, people killed in air raids, people killed in battle for the previous 5 years. But I'd never seen anything like Belsen. This was a great, dusty, open place surrounded by huts with these sort of spectral figures wandering about, and a large number of dead people on the ground. The Germans had not been into the camp for, I think, something like 4 weeks, because the camp had so many epidemic diseases that they were terrified. They were particularly frightened of cholera and typhus. And any mention of either of those two diseases meant that the German soldiers wouldn't go there. So we went in, and to cut a very long story short, we discovered there was absolutely nothing that 30 very well-intentioned but totally ignorant people could do about a human catastrophe of this kind. The impression was one of rage that human beings could conceivably be treated like this.
The Holocaust was an immense crime against humanity. It is the quintessential genocide. It sought the annihilation of the entire Jewish population in Europe, in addition to gypsies and a number of others. It was the deliberate policy decision of a powerful state and mobilized all of its resources to destroy an entire people. They were killed not for what they had done, but for the simple fact of their existence, so the Nazis' worldview formulated Jews as the source of all evils, especially internationalism, pacifism, democracy, and Marxism. The grand scheme of degradation was published in 1924 in Hitler's famous book Mein Kampf. That was years before he came into power, an incredibly vivid warning. But even before 1924, he had made a number of horrifying speeches along these lines that were very well known, that were covered in the German press, but not taken seriously, for the most part characterized as an extremist that is carrying on but wouldn't amount to anything. Hitler's rise to power is extraordinary and could not have happened without the humiliating defeat in World War I, embodied in the Treaty of Versailles. Also, the economic crisis of the post-war period that really badly affected the fragile, emerging German democracy, and the fear of communist revolution as the Marxists took hold of the Soviet Union. So it was in a context of great fear and desperation that the underlying prejudice became more and more susceptible to exacerbation by Hitler and his cronies. When he came to power, racism and anti-Semitism became the official state ideology of the Third Reich, reinforced by incessant, virulent propaganda and anti-Jewish laws. The mass destruction in Germany was extraordinary in that it utilized a highly organized, large bureaucracy in a methodical way, very modern in its systematic division of responsibilities. It was sort of industrialized, the first industrialized genocide. We have to keep in mind a particular failure, the lack of international cooperation to help Germany build a democracy that would prevent Hitler from coming into power and check the momentum of his rise. So that brings us at least some clues about what the 20s and 30s can tell us regarding the prevention of genocide. What are some lessons of the Holocaust for us now? One is that human rights violations within a country are associated with high risk of mass violence both inside and outside. Another is that deeply ingrained intolerance, prejudice, and ethnocentrism, depreciation of one or more outgroups, especially when associated with hyper-nationalistic and other fanatical orientations, whether they are nationalistic or religious or ethnic or whatever, all that makes for sharp dichotomies, us against them, for or against, true believer or infidel, or whatever. That kind of orientation can spread like an infection through a population and across national boundaries. Once released, these hateful viruses are very hard to contain, and that is a lesson for the world. Genocide occurred again in the late 20th century in Rwanda. General Romeo Dallaire, who was the commander of the small UN peacekeeping contingent in Rwanda, describes the situation vividly.
The genocide and the massive abuse of human rights are not a spontaneous event as such. They are a festering, they are a buildup of enormous energy that ultimately a body within a society is able to garner for its own needs at the expense of another group in their society. It is something that has, in fact, been in essence building up, and that someone has been able to garner all that negative energy and ultimately implement it. So we're into the 60s, with two ethnicities that have essentially been at each other's, one having had enormous advantage over the other one, supported by colonial power, and this one that was subordinated, realizing that it can, in fact, gain certain power and be fully participant in a society. This friction that now appears of sort of nearly two equal elites going at each other with enormous misinformation and uneducation in the population, communications done very limited and controlled by government radios and so on. So the passage of information is exceptionally controlled and limited. This gets then amplified by the Cold War, where in order to avoid these potential bush wars in regions beyond the European context, the great powers essentially bought off dictators, established regimes, supported regimes that they felt would keep control, would also be supportive of the economics of whatever resources they might be able to get out of there and so on to their advantage. And so we see power in an artificial sense created by these outside forces that continue to amplify the frictions between them. This sort of evolves quite rapidly into a sense of justice that should be established by those who were previously the underdogs, who now sense that they can have and access power. And so you now have a group that has power at the expense of another group, to the extent where they even conducted killings and massacres.
While hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were killed in the course of the genocide, General Dallaire believed that as few as 5,000 UN troops could have prevented the massacre. His request for these troops was turned down.
Well, in fact, I wasn't even going to go that far. I needed 5,000 troops, not to be an intervention force between the two warring factions. I needed the 5,000 troops to be behind the lines of particularly one of the warring factions to stop the slaughtering. And so if I was able to stop the slaughtering, then there was no reason for the fighting anymore. And so that's why I needed the 5,000 troops. And I felt that the 5,000 troops, that if I gained control of the capital and then spread out from the capital to some of the major areas and essentially do the following, is prove to the Rwandans that it was more risky for them to be on those barriers killing Tutsis than it was by staying home. Because of my force, we would take offensive action together. We would have stymied massively the entity that was actually doing the slaughtering.
In short, General Dallaire had the vision to see, when violence was at a low level, it could get much worse, and he needed only a modest force to provide space for mediation, and then, later, for direct negotiations between the adversaries. Jane Hall Lute, who studied this genocide and later worked ingeniously in peacekeeping operations at the United Nations, agrees with General Dallaire's assessment that the genocide in Rwanda could have been prevented.
No, I absolutely do, and in fact, I point to it a lot because we get asked in peacekeeping whether or not, the UN should have a standing force, and I use this illustration and I absolutely deeply believe that the force of the size he described would have made a difference. Now, would that difference have been 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000? I mean, we can go to almost 1 million. It's very interesting because, I get asked all the time, prevention. Well, how do you prevent deadly conflict? They ask this question because they're predisposed to believe that that the answer is a complicated one, you know, and of course it is. But I invariably respond, if you want to prevent deadly conflict, educate young women, employ young men.
The next genocide could be nuclear, but there is a pervasive myth that genocides cannot be predicted, that they occur suddenly with no warning, like a tsunami or a hurricane. In fact, the opposite is true. The warning signs of an impending genocide appear not just weeks or months, but years and even decades in advance. There are instances in recent world history where potential genocides have been prevented. One powerful example is in South Africa, where decades of apartheid and racial discrimination had produced deep divisions between blacks and whites. In 1994, the white government of South Africa handed over power peacefully to Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and a leader of the struggle, explains some factors that made this possible.
Yeah, I think, credit must be given to very, very, very many other people. I have frequently said that I became a leader of our struggle by default because our real leaders were either in jail, as you've said, Nelson Mandela, and others were on Robben Island and other maximum security prisons, or they were in exile or restricted in one way or another by house arrest or banning orders. And I came into this in part also sharing what was a very important portion in the policies of the African National Congress. As you know, for a very long time, they had espoused non-violence, passive resistance, having been influenced greatly by Gandhi's Satyagraha. So I wasn't as it were, a pioneer. I was continuing a tradition, a legacy that the apartheid government had sought to nip in the bud. As you know, they had bus boycotts. You know, the sort of the traditional, conventional ways of trying to bring your plight to the attention of the authorities. Bus boycotts. And then we did, in fact, have the passive resistance movement in the 1950s, and they had delegations going to petition the powers that be. So I wasn't as it were, innovating. I came into this tradition and happened to be given, especially when I became Dean of Johannesburg, I was given a platform which enabled me to, for some reason actually, the media in South Africa for a very, very long time were very favorably disposed, and so gave me the opportunity of putting across the plight of our people and the fact that we were committed to working through non-violent means.
A good example occurred in a near genocidal situation during the peak of the apartheid regime in South Africa, when you could easily have had a genocide, but did not. You didn't, partly because very committed, non-violent democratic leaders like Desmond Tutu and Mandela and later de Klerk, and partly because the international community was very helpful. People like Cyrus Vance going to South Africa, working for peace, in getting cooperation from many sectors of South African society. They had a very powerful government with tremendous control over the majority. This was minority control. They even had nuclear weapons. They had millions of people packed into resettlement camps, which is a kind of concentration camp under marginal circumstances for survival. And they could have wiped out hundreds of thousands, even millions of people in a short time had they made the genocide decision, the final solution. But they did not do that. One reason the apartheid regime did not make the genocide decision is that they felt they were derived from Europe and they did not want to be pariahs in the world. So they began to respond to external pressure, especially as it affected their economy. To a large extent, the favorable events in South Africa were improvised by brilliant people, dedicated people, highly committed people inside and outside the country. But for the long run, we have to go beyond improvisation and have real pillars of prevention. That is, steps which, if implemented, can indeed help to prevent future genocides in the 21st century. These are foreshadowed in South Africa and elsewhere, but now we need to look more closely at pillars of prevention. The key point of prevention is what to do with early warnings. The first pillar of prevention is proactive help to countries in trouble. That means countries with some kind of intergroup tension that's growing, some kind of scapegoat group that's picked out as a vulnerable outgroup viewed increasingly with animosity by some powerful in-group. That kind of thing is very dangerous. Intergroup tensions that are growing within a country are sometimes exacerbated by bad economic conditions, downturns, free falls, or depressions. Also exacerbated by social disorganization or by the impotence of a state to maintain decent order in what we've come to call failed states. All of those conditions make the likelihood of worsening intergroup tensions. They increase the dangers of mass slaughter, so proactive help is needed. When the democracies of the world and organizations like the United Nations and the European Union see that coming at an early stage, they should reach out a helping hand long before mass violence has occurred. One form of proactive help is preventive diplomacy, meaning essentially early diplomacy before mass violence. Conventional diplomacy is very difficult and prolonged and often fails, even though much has been accomplished. But early on, as you see the signs of trouble brewing, you can reach out a helping hand to adversaries, to be creative about finding a mutual accommodation, a compromise in settling the differences, so that preventive diplomacy is a very important component of proactive help to countries in trouble. This sequence of events is exemplified in Kenya in early 2008. The country was on the verge of civil war and possible genocide, as in Rwanda. But the very timely personal intervention of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, mobilizing other leaders to defuse the situation, negotiated a compromise and ended the crisis.
When I was in Kenya recently, as you know, trying to negotiate the very serious conflict between the opposition and the government, the two groups, I met with the civil society groups, the churches, and the business community, who were extremely well organized, but perhaps weren't able to focus their energy and influence the way that they ought to have. I met a group of businessmen who represented 85% of the GDP in Kenya. So I told them, this is influence, this is power. How do you use that influence? How did you try to influence events? Talk to the politicians and the governments before the explosion. There was silence. And so when we got the agreement, I brought all of them together, the civil society, the churches, and the business community. I met each group and told them, look, now we have an agreement. It's an agreement that can work, but don't leave it to the politicians alone. This is your society too. The society belongs to all of you, and you have to be active, you have to be vigilant, you have to ensure that these agreements are honored. And I also reminded them, when I started the process, I made a deal with them. I told them I want this to be a very transparent process. And so each agreement we sign, I will make public. And that's exactly what we did. We signed an agreement on how to end the violence, agreement on how to deal with the humanitarian situation, and the political settlement, including the need to change the constitution, the need to establish a prime minister and 2 deputy prime ministers, all that with the signatures of the president and the opposition leader were public, because I said you have to monitor it and follow it. And we are hoping we will set up a monitoring mechanism with civil society involvement.
Kofi Annan also brought in leaders of the international community to bolster his efforts, but he made it clear that he was in charge to coordinate the efforts. He elicited their cooperation, some to help with near-term dangers, some to help with long-term measures that could provide an authentic basis of hope for the future of Kenya.
And we are going to set up, they have agreed to set up Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, where we are also asking civil society to make inputs. And this will take a look at the long-term issues which have been at the grassroots of all these problems, going back even to 63 at the time of independence. And they have agreed to undertake comprehensive constitutional, institutional, and land reform settings. So all that was part of the agreements I got them to do, not just put out the fire or deal with the short term, but look at the long-term issues that have infested and undermined society in a way that if they deal with this the way it's designed, they will not have to face crisis or violence at every election. This is about the 5th time the Kenyans have had to face a crisis at time of elections, but this has been the worst and could have really taken them off the cliff.
Lee Hamilton is one of the most respected voices in American foreign policy. He links preventive diplomacy with democracy. He is the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the Congress and is now director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Hamilton believes that diplomatic engagement with other nations, even adversaries, is crucial in fostering peace.
I've never been of the school of thought that says that when you have a problem with a country or a group, that you cut off conversation with them. Some people think that when you have trouble in a country, you pull the ambassador back to Washington. That's nonsense. That's exactly the time you need the ambassador on the scene. And I do not favor an approach that is widely popular in this town that says you don't talk to people you don't like. I don't know how in the world you solve problems in this world without talking to people. And that means you have to talk with friends, of course, but it also means you have to talk with adversaries. I'm not starry-eyed about diplomacy. I know there are some problems you cannot solve with diplomacy, and you always have to integrate the tools of American power: intelligence, military, diplomatic, political, and economic. There are a lot of problems that diplomacy alone will not solve. But on the other hand, I think you have to try diplomacy, and you have to do it in a very robust way, and you have to be patient about it. And David, we have the view here often that sitting down talking to somebody you don't agree with puts your moral stamp of approval on them. That's crazy. I mean, throughout our history, we've talked with all kinds of people we don't like, dictators, brutal dictators, and we've kept talking to them. That doesn't mean you approve of what they're doing. It means you're trying to solve the problem without force.
The next pillar of prevention is the fostering of democracy. Larry Diamond is a professor at Stanford University, author of the book The Spirit of Democracy, The Struggle to Build Free Societies, and one of the world's leading scholars of democracy altogether.
So what does democracy do? Well, first of all, democracy provides a set of rules of the game that institutionalize peaceful competition over policies, over resources, over opportunities to lead, and that ensure that there's going to be a repeated game in which over time the opportunity to lead and to pursue an alternative set of policies or a different distribution of resources will be open over time. And so there can be circulation of elites, circulation of power, in a sense, kind of a circulation of policies. If people get the sense that there's no hope for them to achieve what they want by peaceful means, they're much more likely to use violent means. They're much more likely to take this feeling of exclusion and develop a sense of deep enmity and resentment, that there is some other out there, some other group, some other set of elites that are responsible for their exclusion, and to feel that their grievance can only be relieved by some violent means.
Aggression occurs most readily in authoritarian states where leaders can lie to, inflame, and coerce an intimidated public, especially a public already chafing under repression, injustice, and hatred. Democracies, in contrast, even with their periodic regressions, protect human rights better than non-democratic societies. Fairly elected officials are less likely to engage in large-scale human rights violations, a traditional first step toward genocide. Democracies must have systematic, fair procedures of government that are based on the consent of the governed. Successful democracies all share the themes of fairness and widespread participation in decisions important to the lives of the population. Today, the international democratic community has established special funds to support technical assistance, financial aid, and social exchanges to help build the requisite leaders, processes, and institutions, including widespread education of citizens about how democracy actually works. This support must be sustained over many years. A well-documented body of research shows how culturally diverse groups of children, youth, and adults can be educated to live together harmoniously. This knowledge provides the framework for significant change in educational priorities to cope with new imperatives of the diverse, globalized world, and a shift to the learning and practice of pro-social behaviors across the entire lifespan. Therefore, education for peace should now be one of the central pillars of modern education, not marginal or absent as it has been. Dr. Beatrix Hamburg is a child psychiatrist and co-author of the book Learning to Live Together, Preventing Hatred and Violence in Child and Adolescent Development. She explains how she created a system of peer counseling in the California schools for conflict prevention and resolution.
What we need to do is help people to make good decisions. I also felt this was very important for adolescents to go through how do you make good decisions. And then I said to them that you will be really effective when you help them not only right at this moment, but for the rest of their life to make good decisions. It was a program that involved a lot of socio-emotional learning, conflict resolution, decision-making, and a lot of the principles of behavior. If you want to bring disparate people with negative attitudes about gender, race, religion, that an experience where they have a superordinate goal, and if it's in school, it's classroom, if it's in a community, it's achieving something on behalf of the community that everybody wants, but they can't do without the full cooperation.
So you really then, I remember you taught and wrote about the superordinate goals, something highly valued by children or adolescents in adversarial situations, but they can only get it by cooperation.
Right.
An example of sort of mutual benefit through mutual aid.
Well, I think that it's absolutely key, but more than that, it changes the stereotypes. It breaks them down. The schools need to change. They have to change. I believe that they need to implement their teaching with the internet and with the impacts of the media and the possibilities of the bonding around the world across cultures for all ages of the populations of all countries is now enormously magnified. And I think that we need to begin to look at education for peace in the 21st century.
As a high UN official, Olara Otunu has rich and painful experience with the deficiencies of education in many developing countries.
Yes, I mean, within the UN, I have spent a number of years working to raise awareness about what happens to children in particular who are exposed to situations of war, how to protect them in the midst of war, and how to help to rehabilitate them and give them opportunities of development and education in post-war situations. What I see there, David, there are so many aspects which link up to this, but what I see there is children who are alienated from their society, who are not being given education, who feel embittered, who feel no sense of hope, feel there's nothing for them in the future. They have no future, they have no stake in this society. Those children become very easy prey for exploitation and for enrollment into all kinds of violent and even terrorist enterprises. And when we see a large number of children in that category in any given society, it spells trouble. It's a sign that if nothing is done to remedy that situation, the society will slip into serious difficulties down the road, you know. And unfortunately, we have too many societies where young people, where the youth have been completely neglected, where bright, intelligent, inquisitive children, hungry for knowledge, they want a chance to develop themselves, but no opportunities. So the responsibility of the international community and national governments to really make it a priority, to make it, I would say a priority next to almost none, to invest in young people, to invest in their rehabilitation, invest in their education. That's one of the best things we can do to ensure not just durable peace in a society, but to prevent major conflicts.
Another pillar of prevention is equitable socioeconomic development. This goes hand in hand, especially in poor nations, with promoting democracy and preventing mass violence, including genocide. Professor Jeffrey Sachs teaches at Columbia University. He is one of the world's leading experts on development economics in poor countries.
When I got to Africa, I saw something and experienced a sense of the environment that I had not experienced in many other very poor parts of the world, in India, in China, in Bolivia, elsewhere in Central America and South America, in Central Asia. And that was the unbelievable amount of disease and death that was pervasive in Africa and is pervasive in Africa. When I landed for the first time to visit a Harvard project in 1995 in Zambia, the first thing I was told was the number of our counterparts in the ministries of finance and central bank that had died of AIDS very recently in the course of our project. Then, as I worked more and more in Africa in the mid-1990s and onward, every day, virtually every conversation was filled with stories of death, or someone returning to a village to die, or somebody missing a meeting because their child was down with malaria. And it was shocking to me how much of this was around. An illness like malaria or an epidemic like malaria weighs on a whole society. It changes everything about children's development, about fertility rates, about the potential for profitable investment, the opportunities to attract an industry, to start tourism, to have migration into a region. What were we doing about the disease? It was quite clear that impoverished villages could not take on this challenge by themselves. It was clear to me as a macroeconomist that impoverished countries whose citizens are impoverished villagers could not take on this disease. So I said, what's the international community doing about this? And it took me several years actually to sift through a lot of hand-wringing speeches from a grim reality. And the grim reality was we were doing almost nothing about this. And it wasn't just malaria. With hundreds of speeches about the AIDS pandemic being the greatest pandemic in modern history, perhaps in all of history it was said, what the rich countries were actually doing to help Africa to address the pandemic was so shockingly small, it was almost unbelievable. I found that the total amount of donor aid to sub-Saharan Africa at the end of the 1990s to fight the AIDS pandemic and to fight it in all its forms, prevention, treatment of opportunistic infections, treatment with antiretrovirals, was less than $100 million a year at a time when there already were perhaps 25 million HIV-infected Africans. When I was writing those numbers, I was literally shaking with anguish. How can this be? What kind of world is this? How have we given so many speeches? How have we said this is a world priority and essentially let millions and millions of people die every year, and a pandemic like this run its quote-unquote natural course?
Jeffrey Sachs helped UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to develop the Millennium Goals, which established standards that the Western countries must live up to in order to help the developing countries achieve a decent standard of living. These goals have not yet been met.
What's amazing for me in all of this process is the ability of world leaders to announce goals, have their photo opportunities, get governments committed to something in rhetorical terms, and then seemingly completely forget from the next moment on that any of that matters.
Dr. Amartya Sen is a Nobel Prize-winning economist from India. He has made major contributions to the contemporary understanding and practice of human development. For instance, he has clarified how the education of girls and women is extremely important in fostering development and democracy.
I think the intervention in paying special attention to the schooling of girls itself is a big factor. And education is a leveler in this respect, no question. And one of the things that, you know, with when I was fortunate enough to get the Nobel, I used the money to start 2 trusts, one in India and one in Bangladesh. It's called Kofi Trust, named after my family home. And they deal with basic education, basic healthcare, and gender equity.
Another pillar of prevention is international justice. We have the privilege to interview Juan Mendez, who has been one of the world leaders in protecting and advancing the cause of human rights, the norms and practices, the institutions that facilitate human rights. Juan Mendez is so devoted to this cause that he spent several years in an Argentinian prison in the time of the junta. After that, he came to a distinguished academic career as a professor at the University of Notre Dame, an international lawyer.
I especially like to start by saying that I am a beneficiary of the human rights movement first and foremost, and it was the human rights movement that shortened my time in prison in Argentina and made it possible for me to leave the country at the time when it was impossible to live there for me and my family. But I'm even more of a beneficiary because I was able to join the human rights movement and make a profession, a lifetime career out of defending the rights of others. It was only in the 70s when it became a movement because there were a number of concerned citizens from around the world that formed organizations, beginning with Amnesty International in 1961, to put this into some kind of application in a practical way. And we needed to get to the 70s before important governments took it seriously and incorporated it into foreign policy, beginning with President Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. As you can see, that coincides very exquisitely for my benefit, because it was in the late 70s where the military government of Argentina were conducting this campaign of disappearances and arbitrary imprisonment and torture that I was partially a victim of. Since then, the movement has changed in many different ways, and one can now say that the standard setting continues, but that the emphasis is now on the mechanisms to apply those standards. And I think we are evolving towards the question of prevention. I think the European framers of the European Convention on Human Rights and of its institutions, the Council of Europe and the European Court, were very self-conscious of the need to avoid repetition of the Holocaust and of the attending violence attending the Second World War. And they were very self-conscious of the fact that they needed to have a different conception of sovereignty. And that's why the European system is the model that the rest of the world should follow, in the sense that states recognize their obligation to protect human rights, and that obligation is legitimately transferred to the world community if the government is not up to its obligations. The important thing about the European system is that all governments genuinely accept the binding nature of the norms and of the decisions of the European Court.
Shirley Williams is a member of the British House of Lords. She is a leading expert on democracy, international human rights, and arms control. She believes that legal norms and accountability are an important part of democracy, even in times of war.
The Nuremberg trials were a step forward in one way, in that they said that there should be justice against people who committed crimes against humanity. They were flawed in another way, in that it was victors' justice. Nobody ever applied the rules to the victors of the war, only to the defeated countries of the war. So Germany and Japan were held responsible for the crimes they'd committed against humanity. But in the case of the victors, essentially they did at least establish a system of trials and of courts, although they only put in front of the dock the people who've been defeated. The way in which we've increasingly come to cut corners has arisen in what is wrongly called the war on terrorism. I have a very strong feeling that we should have seen terrorism as a form of crime, international crime, not as a war, because there was no clear identity to who the enemy was. And the trouble with something called a war on terrorism is that you don't have any recognized legal norms which establish, for example, the effect and the inclusiveness of the Geneva Conventions, which are the conventions that protect people in time of war. And we've cut corners. The United States has cut them seriously by creating this concept of enemy combatants who don't have any rights at all. To some extent, the other Western allies have gone along with it. At least they've kept quiet about some of the, I think, shocking corner cutting we've gone in for. We've accepted, in some cases, I think it's beginning to be challenged, a degree of coerciveness in asking questions, which is simply not acceptable in democracy.
Finally, in pillars of prevention, there are restraints on weaponry, where there are a lot of good ideas, but very little has been done to implement those ideas. But there is now a resurgence of efforts, particularly to reduce the nuclear danger. The ultimate is in nuclear weapons, of course, but there's also a huge problem with small arms and light weapons, which is a euphemism for highly lethal weapons like AK-47s, various automatic weapons, mortars, and so on. These weapons can kill many thousands of people in a short time, and the world is covered wall to wall with such weapons. There are just beginning to be ideas in some democratic countries and in the UN about how to get some handle on that problem, but at present there really is no handle available. They are sold in vast quantities by any country they can make them, and cheaply bought all over the world. The immense importance of such preventive efforts is uniquely underlined by the fact that future genocides or humanicides might use nuclear weapons. The final pillar of prevention is therefore restraints on weaponry, above all, nuclear weapons. Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University is one of the world's leading experts on nuclear arms control and nuclear terrorism. He also authored the seminal study on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Essence of Decision.
Historians now agree the Cuban Missile Crisis was the single most dangerous moment in human history. Kennedy said at the time he thought the chances of it rolling to war were somewhere between 1 in 3 and even. That's what he said to his brother quietly when they were just thinking, where could this end? In 1962, maybe there would only been 100 million people killed. But by the mid-'80s, we maybe would have succeeded in killing everybody. So just completely out of proportion with any conceivable purpose, objective, or otherwise. And so the fact that I think I became personally more persuaded that these guys, for sure they didn't want to go there.
William Perry was Secretary of Defense under President Bill Clinton. Perry had seen firsthand, earlier in his life, the devastation of the atomic bombs in Japan after World War II. He made it his mission to prevent the possibility of a nuclear war.
About 2 years before I became Secretary of Defense, you remember this very well, you asked me if I would go with you and Senator Nunn, Senator Lugar, on a trip to Russia and Ukraine. The Cold War was now over, but we had these tens of thousands of nuclear weapons still in the former Soviet Union. Some in Russia, some in Ukraine, some in Belarus, some in Kazakhstan. And the country was in a state of economic, social, and political turmoil. And the question, of course, was what was going to happen to the nuclear weapons under those conditions. Our visit confirmed our worst fears, that the danger of those weapons getting loose was very high indeed. Yeah. And on the airplane trip back, we all sort of conceived of what became the Nunn program as a way of trying to prevent that tragedy from happening. So it was at that stage, I think, that I became focused on the importance of prevention. Less than 2 years later, by a quirk of fate, I became the Secretary of Defense. And then I had the responsibility of implementing the legislation which you and I and Ash and others had helped Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar conceive. So after I became Secretary of Defense, I concluded I should put a very high priority on trying to deal with these loose nukes as we saw them in the former Soviet Union, before one of them got seized by a criminal gang or terror gang and used in the United States. So the focus was clearly on preventing the tragedy before it happened, and the tool for that prevention was already available to us, was the Nunn-Lugar program. Incidentally, the term preventive defense stemmed from defending that program in the Congress.
As Defense Secretary in the 1990s, Perry received a personal threat from Osama bin Laden.
I mean, our whole Cold War strategy with nuclear weapons was deterrence. And against a nation state, deterrence works if you do it carefully. It's a dangerous strategy, but it can work. But against an al-Qaeda, there's no deterrence. Yeah. That's why the key there is one key is trying to work to destroy the al-Qaeda structure, which we are doing in various ways. But the other key is keeping the nuclear weapons out of their hands. That's what all this preventive defense programs on nuclear weapons about it, is not to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of another nation, but to keep them out of the hands of a terror group.
Sam Nunn served as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee for many years. He was instrumental in creating the Nunn-Lugar program, which provided for the destruction of so-called loose nukes in the former Soviet Union, and also for the secure protection of nuclear weapons and materials, and the construction of 2 scientific institutes in Moscow and Kiev to provide constructive opportunities for nuclear-capable scientists and engineers so they would not go to the most dangerous countries. Senator Nunn flew to Moscow immediately after the failed coup in 1991 and met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in an effort to assess the dangers.
Gorbachev had been released. I went to Russia at his request. He expedited the visas, which was unheard of. I got on the plane the next day. I spent a week in Russia talking to everybody there, virtually, that was new in power, because Yeltsin had clearly de facto taken control. I also visited Gorbachev, and of course he had just been released. I had known him for a long time. And I remember one of the questions I asked him very vividly. We were walking to the door, because I had not expected to meet with him, but he did meet for about 45 minutes. As we were walking to the door, after having talked about a lot of different things in the future of the Soviet Union, still the Soviet Union, I said to him, Mr. President, did you have control of the nuclear weapons, the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union during your captivity? He had always answered my questions very candidly, a remarkable man. I think he made a tremendous contribution to history. But he didn't answer that question. He said, Senator, we're not going to talk about that. Napoleon once supposedly said to his men before they went into battle, he pointed to their bayonet and he said, men, you can do anything with your bayonet except sit on it. He wanted them to use it. I feel just the opposite about nuclear weapons. The only thing you can do with nuclear weapons is sit on them, because it's too horrible to even think about the use of those weapons.
Professor Sidney Drell of Stanford University has joined with Senator Nunn and others in working toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. Drell is an eminent physicist and one of the world's leading arms control experts.
I resisted for many years the call to disarm weapons because we had the Cold War thinking in the 1980s that what we were trying to do is step by step with the Soviet Union to control the growth of weapons and even to begin to reduce the number, which really initiated with the summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, President Ronald Reagan and General Secretary then Mikhail Gorbachev in 1986. 20 years later, with the Cold War a thing of the past for 15 years, in 2006, the Soviet Union was in the dustbin of history. Russia and the United States were cooperating in 2006 against a mutual threat to us both of terrorism, and yet we have nuclear forces on hair trigger alert facing each other, ready to go for a Holocaust. And we had done very little about it. But what was worse was, with the spread of technology around the world, a very different but very threatening new danger arose. And that is, with the spread of technology, with the growth of terrorism in failed states, the proliferation of weapons, which have been terminated for 20 years with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the number of countries sitting at 8, was now beginning to crumble. The non-proliferation regime that was beginning to crumble. And so we realized that there were grave new dangers, the spread of technology, the worst weapon getting into the most dangerous hands, and we were doing nothing about it. Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, two remarkable people who were really nuclear abolitionists of a very deep sort. There are 40 nations in the world now which are judged technically capable of producing nuclear weapons. Not 8 or 9 with North Korea, but 40, and the number's growing. And if they get them, we may not have a nuclear holocaust with tens of thousands of weapons, but you may have more likely that some crazy with nothing to lose is going to have one in the middle of New York or San Francisco or London or Paris. And we have to do something. And that's what got us started thinking, let's really address seriously the question, what will it take? How would you get around to getting rid of nuclear weapons? And so this is a process. It's a long process. And I think everybody in the room would say, I really don't know how to make that last step. But I think saying that this is our vision, we're working toward it, will make it more likely that in a realistic timescale, we can make progress.
Finally, there is the question of who can prevent genocide. The United Nations, the European Union, NATO, other regional organizations, and non-governmental organizations can all play important roles in this process. Both inside and outside those organizations, the major democracies have great responsibilities which they are only beginning to meet. All this is very new to the United Nations. There are many obstacles to overcome. We have for several years had a UN unit on a very small scale, but very intelligent on preventing genocide. It is expanding year by year. The European Union is 27 cooperating democracies, unheard of in history. They have a strong moral commitment, especially the Germans, who have reacted very powerfully against what their ancestors did in the Holocaust. We have a European-wide movement to support efforts of building the pillars of prevention. They've built some of the pillars. They've done more to build the pillars of democracy and development than anybody else already. And now they are getting better at the early step to some countries in trouble, not only in Europe, but beyond Europe. Javier Solana is the Secretary General of the Council of the European Union and a truly remarkable leader. He believes that the EU has a significant role to play in preventing genocide.
I think in trying to prevent mass violence, I think it's very important the cooperation of the European Union and the United States, no doubt about that. And I think we have had a very good relationship in that direction, both in Bosnia and in Kosovo through NATO, And in Macedonia, as I mentioned before, we were cooperating also. But it's been very important in the last period of time for me, the cooperation with the African Union. The African Union has emerged as an organization that has matured in a rather short period of time very much in going into the understanding of all these kind of complicated issues that we have now on the table. And I found that cooperation sometimes difficult, but in any case, the step that has been, how he has moved that cooperation in the last period of time is really extraordinary. And I hope very much that will continue. And to see how these ideas, like the responsibility to protect, being expanded not only in the European Union, not only the United States, but also in a good number of countries in Africa.
In January 2009, Javier Solana stated concisely 5 lessons of global diplomacy that he has learned from his rich experience throughout the world. First, the solution is always political. Second, intervention must serve a political strategy and take account of the fact that foreign policy is all about the domestic politics of others. Third, personalities and trust are essential. Fourth, no single country, not even the United States, can solve problems on its own. Fifth, the best time to deal with a problem is the moment it arises. 4, positions become entrenched, ideally before anyone has noticed there is a problem at all. But if that fails, you need to be ready to stick to it for a long time. Jane Hall-Lute, who has extensive experience in the UN, believes that it too can play a useful role in preventing genocide and other deadly conflicts.
We've seen in talking to victims in the Eastern Congo and in Darfur and in a number of places where there are peacekeeping missions around the world, and breaking out of the cycles of violence seems so difficult because there is this accumulated desire for revenge and to settle past scores. The benefits of prevention are so well known to so many because you can see the destruction and lives lost and in people displaced and in property and agriculture and infrastructure and the whole social fabric just destroyed by the kind of violence we're talking about. Far better to prevent it. What would it take?
Kofi Annan is the former Secretary General of the United Nations and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize.
Remember in 2004, at the 10th anniversary of the Rwanda genocide, I came up with a strategy to fight genocide, including the appointment of the special advisor on prevention of genocide, but really stressing the fact that we needed to prevent armed conflict. We needed to protect civilians in armed conflict. We needed to listen to the early warnings and move quickly, and also generated lots of discussion about prevention of conflict. But I also saw things in a much broader context. I know that when I talked about the human dignity and protection of the individual, and then brought in the issue of economic development, because you may recall that the UN, in its dealings with the public, at times we focus so much on the political, but to get them to think of poverty, to get them to think of Millennium Development Goals that will directly impact on the lives of the poor, to get them to accept that there was an economic basis to conflict. Poverty can lead, are things that I try to push very much to the fore.
Francis Deng, Under-Secretary General for Prevention of Genocide and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General, is one of the great leaders for the prevention of mass violence. He is a person who bridges the gap between the world of scholarship and the world of policy, who has deep knowledge of matters pertinent to prevention, and who has also had on-the-ground experience in institutions and organizations throughout the world.
Our general assumption is that those who are within the borders of their states are protected and assisted by their countries, and that the world should not get involved in the internal affairs of countries. But when you have countries in conflict, countries that are acutely divided, where there are deep cleavages, in most cases, the state is a party to the conflicts. The government is a party to the conflicts. So that instead of protecting their people, they neglect them and persecute them. Which means that these people who live in a vacuum of state responsibility to protect them have to look somewhere else. And that means to the outside world. When they do so, these states take the banner of sovereignty and use it as a barricade against international involvement. I see sovereignty positively as a concept of state responsibility for its people, and if need be, with the support of the international community. And as I say, the subtext is, if you don't discharge that responsibility and your people are suffering, obviously the world will not leave you alone. If I go in and I say things that make them feel immediately hostile, then doors will be closed again. Be kicked out, doors closed. It doesn't mean that you don't raise difficult issues. It doesn't mean that you whitewash what is going on. Now, how do we apply this to my present mandate? To the extent that we're talking about prevention, and as you yourself as chairman of the advisory committee have often pointed out, we need to get in at a point when the situation is developing but has not escalated to the point of positions hardening. There is no organization that has the capacity that the UN has to deal with these situations. There is also a great deal of willingness, there's a lot of goodwill to do just that, to bring these resources together. You saw in the meeting we had of the advisory committee and how the different representatives of the agencies came and were pledging what they could do from within their own institutions to support the work of our mandate. That is the other thing, is to strike that delicate balance between being constructive with governments, but also being able to talk with governments in a way that can bring about reform. Otherwise, we simply just support the status quo.
Archbishop Tutu also believes there is a greater role for the United Nations in preventing genocide than there was in the past. He has been active in guiding its new program.
I believe, actually, that what you have done, you probably will not acknowledge it, but a great deal of credit is due to you, that the UN should in fact have set up this committee for the special committee for the prevention of genocide and to make it a fairly high profile unit. It is largely due to your persuasive eloquence that both Kofi and even more importantly his successor should have seen that this was an important thing.
The remarkable improvements in the human condition that have occurred during my lifetime suggest that prevention of genocide is also within reach in this century. We have seen the end of flagrant colonialism and imperialism, unprecedented advances in health and reduction of poverty, the worldwide spread of human rights, including the success of the U.S. civil rights movement of the 1960s, the end of fascist and communist totalitarianism, the end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid and the emergence of democracy in South Africa, indeed the spread of democracy throughout much of the world. Slavery has also at last come to an end in most of the world, though nasty pockets still exist. All of these triumphs have limits and periodic setbacks, but overall they represent great advances. We see in the decline of all these evils strong expressions of emerging human decency, but also a need for constant vigilance to mobilize human capacities for fully learning to live together in personal dignity and shared humanity. The dramatic improvements in Europe in the decades since World War II suggest that humanity could be on the verge of a serious, informed, sustained effort to prevent recurrence of atrocities like the Holocaust. We hope that this film will stimulate interest in this great mission and generate better ideas so that our children and grandchildren will move us into a world of decent human relations at last.